In the midst of a crowded courtroom, a sharp slap echoed through the tense silence, slicing through the air like a thunderclap. The room froze, every eye darting to the source of the disturbance, every breath held in collective disbelief. Two arrogant cops, their faces twisted with disdain, had just struck a quiet black woman, one they assumed was another powerless bystander. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom, was that she wasn't just a figure sitting at the back of the room, waiting to pass judgment. She was the judge. And in that instant, everything they thought they controlled began to unravel. The courtroom, once a place where the system had reigned unchecked, became a battleground for a reckoning. Clara May, 62 years old, a woman of steely calm and quiet authority, stood still, her cheek stinging from the slap, but her gaze unwavering, locked onto the man who dared to lay hands on her. The hushed whispers of the audience grew louder, but Clara didn't flinch, didn't look away. She was not just another person to be silenced or intimidated. This was not just a slap. It was a moment, a shift in the very fabric of the law that had allowed men like him to believe they were untouchable. The room held its breath as the walls of power, arrogance, and entitlement began to crumble. The law wasn't a weapon to be wielded in arrogance. It was a shield for truth, and Clara was about to make sure everyone knew it. The tension was palpable, the eyes of the world, of the courtroom, now on her. The fight for justice was no longer whispered in the shadows. It roared. Charleston, South Carolina, stood like a city caught between two worlds. Its graceful architecture and cobblestone streets a stark contrast to the deep, unresolved tensions that pulsed beneath the surface. The city was steeped in history, its past both revered and haunting, whispering stories of times long gone while harboring secrets that still simmered just beneath the veneer of its southern charm. It was early morning, the sun barely cresting the horizon, casting a golden hue over the city's skyline. As the first rays of light hit the Atlantic, Clara May arrived at the courthouse, her presence quiet but undeniably commanding. At 62, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight, no-nonsense bun and eyes that could pierce through any pretense, Clara carried herself with an authority that needed no introduction. She was the first black woman to sit on this city's highest bench, and although the halls of justice had seen many before her, none had faced the weight of history quite like she did. She walked through the cold, imposing halls of the courthouse, her steps deliberate, as if each one was a reminder that she belonged here, no matter how much some tried to ignore it. The marble walls had witnessed countless trials, some of justice, others of corruption, but none as personal as hers. Over 3 decades, Clara had fought tirelessly for what was right, first as a defense attorney for those who had been forgotten by the system, then as a prosecutor determined to clean out the rot from within, and now as a judge. The power she wielded was not born of title or position, but from her unwavering belief in fairness. And on this day, something was about to change. The quiet tension that hung in the air was palpable, the calm before the storm. Clara knew it. The city knew it, and the world would soon know too. The courthouse loomed ahead, its neoclassical columns towering like silent sentinels, guarding centuries of justice and injustice alike. Inside, Clara May was no stranger to these halls, having walked them for over 30 years. She had witnessed the slow grind of the law, seen both the weight of its power and the cracks in its foundation. The marble floors beneath her feet had once felt like a battleground as a young defense attorney, fighting for those too often dismissed by a system that favored power over truth. Later, as a prosecutor, she had waged her own war from within, pushing to purge the very corruption that had tainted the system she believed in. And now, as a judge, she stood at the pinnacle, the first black woman to ever hold this position in Charleston's highest court. Yet, despite the hard-earned respect and the authority her title commanded, Clara knew all too well that the battle was far from over. The same halls that had witnessed her triumphs had also seen the countless injustices swept under the rug. It was a bitter truth she carried with her every day, the knowledge that her success had come at a cost, and that her very presence in this seat of power was a reminder to some that the system was changing. Her sharp brown eyes scanned the courtroom as she walked through the security checkpoint, the guards nodding respectfully, their silent acknowledgement of her authority. But Clara's mind wasn't on the pleasantries of the morning. She was already focused, her instincts kicking in. Something was off today. The air in the courtroom felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Today was supposed to be routine, a simple juvenile bond hearing for a vandalism case, but Clara knew better. She could feel it deep in her bones. This day would be anything but ordinary. The storm was coming, and she was ready to face it head on. As Clara stepped into the courtroom, the familiar hum of the morning seemed to fade into the background, swallowed by the rising tension in the air. The room was still, the heavy silence punctuated only by the sound of her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Her eyes, always sharp and watchful, swept over the scene, already assessing the subtle shifts in the room. At the prosecution table stood Sergeant Travis Boone, arms crossed, his posture rigid and arrogant as ever. He didn't even glance at her as she entered, his eyes fixed instead on the juvenile defendant, a skinny, wide-eyed teenager who looked as if he wished he could disappear into the chair. The air around Boone was thick with his usual air of entitlement, the kind of arrogance that came with knowing he had the power to bend the system to his will. The kind of arrogance that made him think he could treat people, especially those beneath him, as if they didn't matter. Clara's jaw tightened as she caught sight of him. She knew him well. Too well. Boone was no stranger to controversy, and his reputation as a cop who skirted the law was as well known as his smug, ever-present smirk. He had made a career out of stepping on others, of pushing the boundaries of his power and never once having to face the consequences. And now, here he was, just a few feet away, playing his usual game. Clara's pulse quickened, not out of fear, but from something more instinctive, something deeper, something she had learned over decades of fighting this system. She was no longer the attorney or the prosecutor. She was the judge now, and she wasn't about to let him walk all over her or anyone else in this courtroom. She moved silently to the side, her gaze never leaving Boone as the clerk approached her. "Sergeant Boone's already inside, Judge May," the clerk said, his voice tight, like he too could feel the pressure in the room. Clara nodded curtly. She didn't need any more words. She could already feel the storm brewing. The reckoning was coming, and she was going to make sure it didn't pass quietly. Clara stood still, her gaze fixed on Sergeant Boone, the room suddenly stifling with tension. The silence that followed the slap was thick, suffocating, as if the very air had paused to absorb the shock of what had just happened. Papers that had been rustling moments before fell still, cups of coffee hovered precariously in hands, and even the fluorescent lights above seemed to flicker in response to the crack of violence. The entire room held its breath, but Clara, unshaken, remained a figure of quiet authority. Her cheeks stung, a fiery mark left by the impact, but not a muscle in her face twitched. She didn't flinch, didn't move, only locked her eyes onto Boone's, her expression unreadable but resolute. Boone took a step back, his face registering confusion, but there was no remorse. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, as if to say he had done nothing wrong, as if his actions had been justified. "Not even close," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You people need to learn some respect." The words barely reached Clara before they were swallowed by the silence in the room. The gasps from the back, the whispers from the onlookers, all of it faded into the background. Clara's eyes never left his face. Her voice, when it came, was measured and cold, slicing through the tension with surgical precision. "Is this how you treat officers of the court, Sergeant?" she asked, the weight of her question making his earlier defiance seem hollow. Boone blinked twice, unsure of where the ground beneath him was shifting, but Clara knew. The moment his hand made contact with her skin, he had crossed a line, and there would be no returning from it. He had underestimated the power of this courtroom, the power of this woman. Clara stepped forward, each movement deliberate, as the tension thickened like a noose tightening around Boone's neck. The room was no longer a place for pretense. It had become the stage for something far larger. The game had changed, and Clara May was not just a player. She was the one who controlled the rules. Clara didn't move an inch after the slap. Her cheek burned, the sting of the impact sharp and unforgiving. But she didn't reach for it, didn't even flinch. The silence that descended in the room was suffocating, hanging thick in the air like smoke. Every eye was on her, waiting for her to react. Yet Clara remained statuesque, her expression unmoving, her gaze fixed solely on Boone, who now took a hesitant step back, eyes widening in surprise. But there was no shame in his face, no remorse. Just the arrogant flicker of someone who thought they could get away with anything. He stood tall, his chest puffed out, as if daring anyone to challenge him. "Not even close," he muttered, his voice a mix of defiance and casual disdain. "You people need to learn some respect." His words were like poison, meant to degrade, meant to belittle. But Clara didn't blink. She didn't react to the insult. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her presence commanding every inch of the room. The air seemed to crackle with a sudden, undeniable force. "Is this how you treat officers of the court, Sergeant?" Clara's voice, calm and steady, cut through the tension like a knife. The words landed with weight, sinking deep into the consciousness of everyone present. It wasn't just a question. It was an accusation. Boone opened his mouth, ready to retort, but Clara wasn't finished. "Did you just strike me in this courtroom?" She repeated, her tone colder now, sharper, like the edge of a blade. Her voice, so composed and unwavering, held no room for excuses, no space for apologies. The room seemed to hold its breath, the murmurs from the back of the room growing louder, the realization of what had just happened beginning to sink in. Boone shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering for the first time. The weight of Clara's authority crushed the arrogance that had once defined him. The reality was dawning on him, and with it came fear, fear that he had done something he could never undo. Clara didn't just hold the power of the bench, she held the power of truth, and she wasn't about to let him forget that. Clara stood still, her gaze unwavering, and in that moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The silence was deafening, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Boone, once so sure of himself, now stood frozen, his face drained of color, his posture stiff. The full realization of what he had done began to settle over him like a suffocating fog. Clara's voice, when it came, sliced through the heavy air like a blade. "Sergeant Boone, did you just strike me in this courtroom?" The words were deliberate, cold, and unyielding, as if each syllable carried the weight of judgment itself. Boone's jaw tightened, and for a split second, it seemed as though he might deny it, might try to spin the truth into something more palatable. But Clara wasn't giving him that luxury. "I didn't know who you were," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, defensive and laced with the desperation of a man who knew he had crossed a line. Clara didn't flinch. "That is not what I asked," she snapped, cutting through his flimsy excuse. "Did you just put your hands on me? Yes or no?" Her words echoed in the stillness, a demand for accountability. Boone blinked, his eyes darting nervously around the room, but no one came to his aid. The faces of the officers standing at the back of the room were a study in tension. Even the most loyal among them could not meet his eyes. And then, with chilling finality, Clara spoke again. "You assaulted a woman unprovoked in a courtroom, and your only defense is ignorance and arrogance." Her voice, steady as steel, filled the room with undeniable authority. The truth hung in the air, palpable and undeniable. Boone tried to regain some semblance of control, but the words caught in his throat. Clara was no longer just a judge. She had become a force, one that would not be silenced, one that would not let his actions go unchecked. And in that moment, she knew. This was just the beginning. The power had shifted, and she was in control now. Clara's gaze never wavered as she stood in the center of the courtroom, every inch of her body exuding a quiet, undeniable strength. The silence was suffocating, but she didn't flinch. Boone, now visibly shaken, was still trying to grasp the full extent of his actions, the shock of his own behavior flickering across his face. He had expected something different. A quick apology, a dismissal, perhaps a chance to shrug it off and move on. But Clara wasn't offering him any of that. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice cutting through the room with surgical precision. "If I were a white male judge sitting here with the same title, would you have slapped me without knowing who I was?" The question hung in the air like a bomb, its weight far heavier than any accusation. Boone's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing as he scrambled for an answer, but none came. The room seemed to hold its breath, every person in it waiting for his response, for some shred of defense. But Boone had none. Clara's eyes never left his, unblinking, unyielding. "I'll take that as a no," she said coldly, her voice laced with disdain. The room, once so tense with uncertainty, now buzzed with the realization of what was happening. Clara wasn't just a victim here. She was a force to be reckoned with. She turned, her words sharp as she addressed the room. "You've just compounded your assault with defiance." The finality in her voice was absolute. Boone opened his mouth to speak again, but Clara's next words silenced him completely. "You are overreacting," he said, his voice rising, trying to reclaim some control, but Clara cut him off. "You are not justified," she said, her voice ice cold. "You assaulted a woman without provocation, and now you're trying to twist it into something else." She turned to the clerk, her voice crisp and clear. "Please enter into the record that Sergeant Boone has admitted on the record to striking a sitting judge without cause or provocation." Clara's gaze stayed locked on Boone, not giving him an inch, not allowing him the space to hide behind excuses. Today, there would be no escape. The game had changed, and Sergeant Boone had no idea what he had just unleashed. Clara's eyes never left Boone as the courtroom buzzed with whispers. The silence that followed her command was thick with anticipation, and the weight of what had just transpired hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Boone, who had once strutted around this room with an air of invincibility, now seemed smaller, diminished, his defiance cracking under the weight of Clara's unwavering gaze. She could feel the shift in the room, the subtle but undeniable sense that the power was no longer his. He stood there, a man who had lived his life free of consequences, thinking he could bend the law to his will without anyone ever calling him to account. But today, Clara May was here, and today there would be no more sweeping things under the rug. "Sergeant Boone," Clara said, her voice smooth as glass but sharp as a blade, "you have assaulted a woman unprovoked in a courtroom, and now you will face the consequences." The words seemed to land like an avalanche, each syllable carrying the weight of years of unaddressed misconduct, years of unchecked power. Boone shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room, but no one came to his defense. Not today. Clara's voice dropped, her tone becoming colder still. "I have spent my life watching men like you mistake force for law, mistake fear for order." She let the words hang in the air, heavy with truth. But not today. The room was still, the collective breath of everyone inside held in suspense. Clara moved towards the bench, taking her seat with the grace and authority that only someone who had earned their place could possess. "In accordance with the authority vested in me as a circuit judge for the state of South Carolina," she said, her voice echoing in the now still room, "I hereby place Officer Travis Boone under formal judicial investigation for criminal assault on a public official." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Boone's face had drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing in a silent plea for escape, but there was nowhere left to hide. Not anymore. Clara had just shattered his world, and there was no coming back from this. Clara stood tall, her presence commanding the room as if the very walls trembled in her wake. The gasps from the back of the courtroom had barely subsided when she turned her piercing gaze onto Officer Boone, who was now beginning to grasp the enormity of his mistake. The room, once thick with tension, was now suffused with a new energy, the kind that happens when the impossible suddenly seems not only possible, but inevitable. Clara's voice rang out, sharp and unwavering, as she addressed the gallery. "The actions of Sergeant Boone will not be swept under the rug today. This is not just a courtroom incident. It's a reflection of everything wrong with a system that lets men like him go unchecked for far too long." She let the words hang in the air, heavy with meaning, as Boone shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The arrogance had drained from him, leaving behind a shell of the man who had once thought himself untouchable. He opened his mouth to speak, but Clara wasn't finished. She turned to the clerk, her tone crisp and absolute. "Please enter into the record that Officer Travis Boone has assaulted a sitting judge in front of witnesses, on record, with cameras rolling." The words carried an undeniable weight, and the room fell into an almost eerie silence. Clara's gaze never faltered as she addressed the officers at the back of the room, her voice cold but full of authority. "Is this courtroom under video surveillance?" she asked. The officer nodded, his voice tight as he confirmed. "Good," Clara said, her eyes narrowing. "Then let the record reflect the evidence. Boone's actions will not be erased this time. She stood up from the bench, her movements deliberate, every step filled with quiet defiance. Sergeant Boone, she continued, you have just made a grave mistake. Your arrogance, your violence, it ends today. No one is above the law, not even you. The room held its breath as Clara's words crashed down like a gavel. And with that, Clara May sealed Boone's fate, not just with words, but with the full force of justice behind them.